My mother texted me that I was uninvited from our family cruise right after I paid $15,000 for their suite upgrades. She claimed my white brother-in-law gave my ticket to his mother because they only wanted real family on this trip. I smiled, turned around, and sold the $400,000 house they were living in. You will not believe their faces when they return to a pile of rubble. Let me know where you are watching from below and hit subscribe. I stared at my phone screen. The text message from my mother Beatrice sat there like a physical slap. You are not coming. Dad wants just family. Preston gave your ticket to his mother. There were no apologies or explanations, just a cold dismissal from a luxury cruise leaving in 12 hours. A trip I funded. I did not cry. I was 32 years old, the founder of a fintech company worth millions. I had spent my entire life crying over people who only saw me as an ATM. Instead of shedding a tear, I let out a sharp laugh. I grabbed my car keys and drove to my parents' house in Cascade Heights, a prestigious black neighborhood in Atlanta. I pushed the heavy oak front door open without knocking. The scene inside their home looked like a promotional shoot for a luxury travel magazine. My mother Beatrice and my father Calvin were bustling around the living room, zipping up matching Louis Vuitton luggage. Over by the kitchen island, my younger sister Chloe and her husband Preston were sipping mimosas. Preston, with his perfectly styled blonde hair and smug smile, looked entirely too comfortable. He was a flashy wealth manager who loved throwing around buzzwords to impress my father. Chloe spotted me first. She lowered her crystal glass and let out a dramatic sigh. Maya, what are you doing here? Mom told you the plans changed. I ignored my sister and walked straight up to Preston. I want to know exactly what happened to the $15,000 I wired you last Tuesday, I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. The money I sent to upgrade Mom and Dad to the presidential suite. Preston did not even flinch. He took another sip of his mimosa and offered a condescending smirk. Relax, Maya. I used my platinum status with the cruise line to get those suite upgrades for free. It is about knowing the right people. Since we did not need your cash for the rooms, I rolled that $15,000 into a high-yield retirement portfolio for Calvin. He needs real assets, not vacation money. My father. Calvin nodded approvingly from across the room, completely ignoring the fact that Preston had essentially stolen my money and repurposed it without my permission. Preston knows what he is doing, Maya, my father said, snapping a suitcase shut. He is securing our legacy. You should be thanking him instead of coming in here making demands. Thanking him, I turned to face my father. I sent that money specifically for your trip. And my ticket. The one I paid for months ago. My mother stepped forward, smoothing her silk outfit. She looked at me with the weary disappointment she had worn since I dropped out of medical school. Let us be honest, Maya, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. This cruise is hosting elite investors. Preston arranged private dinners that could change our family future. She paused, taking in my simple jeans and plain sweater. You are a low-level IT help desk worker. You do not know how to mingle in these circles. You would just sit in the corner looking miserable and embarrass us in front of his mother. It is better for everyone if you stay home. Chloe giggled from the kitchen, swirling the orange juice and champagne in her glass. Honestly, Maya, you should be relieved. You do not even own evening wear. Preston is just protecting the family image. I looked at the four of them. My mother, who cared more about church committee gossip than her own flesh and blood. My father, who worshipped a white son-in-law because he desperately wanted to feel like a wealthy patriarch. My sister, the golden child who felt entitled to everything. And Preston, the arrogant con artist who was playing them all for absolute fools. They thought I was just a tech support girl fixing computers for an hourly wage. They had no idea I spent 10 years building a real estate platform. They had no idea my company was valued at $80 million. Most importantly, they had no idea that 3 years ago, when Preston supposedly saved this house from foreclosure by pulling strings, he had done nothing. I bought this house in cash through a blind company to keep my parents off the street. I was their landlord. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. They expected me to yell, to cry, beg for my spot, or demand my money back. They expected me to be the emotional disappointment they always claimed I was. Instead, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. The invisible chains of daughterly obligation snapped right then and there. "Have a wonderful trip," I said smoothly, forcing a warm smile onto my face. "I hope the ocean is beautiful. Enjoy the presidential suite." My mother looked taken aback, but quickly recovered, waving her hand toward the door. "Just lock the deadbolt on your way out, Maya. And do not come over here while we are gone. We do not want you tracking dirt onto the rugs." I walked out the front door, Chloe and Preston laughing behind me. I pulled out my phone and found my commercial real estate broker. I typed a definitive message. "List the house. Cash buyers only. I want it sold and closed within exactly 48 hours. I hit send and drove away. I parked my car 3 blocks down the street under the shade of a massive oak tree and waited. 10 minutes later, a sleek black stretch limousine pulled into my parents' driveway. I watched through my tinted windows as Preston stepped out first, directing the driver to handle the matching designer luggage. My mother, Beatrice, floated out of the front door wearing a wide-brimmed vacation hat, laughing at something Preston said. Chloe was right behind her, holding her phone high in the air. I could almost hear the fake, cheerful pitch of her voice as she recorded an Instagram live video for her followers. She panned the camera to Preston, who kissed her cheek, and then to my father, Calvin, who was proudly patting Preston on the back. They looked like the ultimate successful American family, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire reality was built on a foundation of my money. The limousine doors closed with a heavy thud, and the long black car glided down the street, turning the corner and disappearing from sight. The second they were gone, I put my car in drive and pulled right back into their empty driveway. I walked up to the front door, pulled a brass key from my pocket, and let myself in. The house was dead quiet. The scent of my mother's expensive vanilla candles still lingered in the air. I walked slowly through the foyer, my heels clicking sharply against the imported Brazilian hardwood floors. I ran my hand along the custom wainscoting in the hallway. My father loved to brag to his golf buddies about the craftsmanship of this house. He loved to tell everyone how his brilliant son-in-law had saved their family legacy. 3 years ago, the facade of my parents' wealth had cracked. Calvin had made some terrible investments, and a bright pink foreclosure notice had been taped to this very front door. I remember my mother weeping in the kitchen, terrified of the neighborhood gossip. I remember my father looking broken, a proud man stripped of his dignity. I did not want them to suffer, but I also knew their pride could never accept a bailout from the daughter they considered a failure. So I hired a corporate attorney, formed a blind limited liability company, and bought the debt outright in cash. I purchased the house entirely, allowing them to stay without paying a dime in rent. But I underestimated Preston. A week after the bank cleared the title, Preston showed up at our Sunday family dinner with a bottle of expensive champagne. He stood up at the head of the table and boldly lied to my parents' faces. He told them he had pulled massive strings with his elite banking contacts to restructure their debt and magically erase the foreclosure. My father had wept and hugged him, calling him the son he never had. My mother praised God for sending them such a brilliant financial savior. I had sat at the end of the table, quietly eating my dinner, choosing to let my father keep his pride rather than exposing Preston as a fraud. That was my mistake. I had chosen peace over truth, and they had rewarded me by literally leaving me on the dock. The doorbell rang, pulling me out of my memories. I opened the door to find Marcus Sterling standing on the porch. Marcus was a corporate real estate developer known throughout Atlanta for his absolute ruthlessness. He was the kind of man who bought family neighborhoods and turned them into concrete parking structures and luxury strip malls. He walked inside without wiping his shoes, his sharp eyes instantly scanning the crown molding and the high ceilings. "You have got a beautiful property here," Maya, Marcus said, pulling a laser measuring tape from his jacket pocket. "But you know, I do not care about the house. I want the land. The zoning board just approved commercial development for this block, and I need this corner lot for a new retail complex. I am going to bulldoze this place to the ground." I crossed my arms and leaned against the marble kitchen island. I know exactly what you do, Marcus. That is why I called you. What is your offer? Marcus chuckled, clearly amused by my directness. He walked around the living room tapping the walls. Usually people are sentimental about these things. They want time to pack up memories. They want top dollar. If you put this on the market, you could easily get 450,000. But I am an investor. I want it cheap and I want it fast. I will give you 350,000 in pure cash. It was an insulting lowball offer, almost $100,000 under market value. My parents would have a heart attack if they knew someone was pricing their precious estate so poorly. But I did not care about the money. I had $80 million sitting in my corporate accounts. I only cared about the timeline. I will accept your 350,000, I said, looking him dead in the eye. But I have one non-negotiable condition. We bypass the standard escrow period. No inspections, no lengthy appraisals, no contingencies. My lawyer has the deed ready. I want the paperwork signed today, and I want the deal fully closed in exactly 48 hours. Marcus stopped walking. He lowered his measuring tape and stared at me, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He recognized a ruthless business move when he saw one. 48 hours is aggressive, he said, pulling his phone out to text his legal team. But for a cash deal with a clean title, I can make it happen. Consider it sold. He typed furiously for a moment, finalizing the instructions for his office. Then he paused, looking around at the lavish living room. The velvet sofas, the crystal vases, my mother's grand piano, the massive oil painting of my parents hanging above the fireplace. He frowned, gesturing to the expensive items filling the house. What about all this furniture? Marcus asked, tapping his pen against his phone. We cannot bring the bulldozers in with the house fully furnished. Do you need a few weeks to hire a moving company to pack everything up safely? I looked at the oil painting of my parents. I thought about the text message my mother sent me. I thought about Preston laughing while spending my money on his own mother. I smiled, a genuine cold smile that reached all the way to my eyes. Do not worry about being gentle, I told Marcus. Send a crew over tomorrow morning. Pack it all in heavy-duty black trash bags and throw it in the cheapest, dirtiest public storage unit you can find. Let them deal with it when they get back. Somewhere in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, Chloe was busy curating her fake reality. She held her phone high above her head, spinning in circles on the teak balcony of the presidential suite. Hey guys, just checking in from paradise, she cooed to her live audience, making sure the endless ocean view and the complimentary champagne bucket were perfectly framed. Preston strutted into the shot wearing a custom linen suit that screamed old money. He wrapped his arm tightly around her waist, kissing her cheek for the camera. They were the ultimate picture of success and marital bliss. But behind the camera lens, the reality was unraveling faster than they could possibly comprehend. Later that evening, Preston booked a private table at the ship's most exclusive dining room. It was a VIP enclave reserved only for high rollers and elite investors. This was exactly the kind of crowd my mother Beatrice desperately wanted to impress. She wore her best jewelry sitting up perfectly straight to ensure everyone noticed her. They sat at a large mahogany table under a crystal chandelier, ordering white truffles, imported Wagyu beef, and a bottle of vintage wine that cost more than my parents' first car. Preston was in his element, loudly discussing offshore accounts and stock portfolios to ensure the wealthy guests at the adjacent tables could hear every word. My father Calvin nodded along to every syllable, completely entranced by the illusion of massive wealth. When the check finally arrived in a sleek leather folder, the total was well over $2,000. Preston did not even bother looking at the itemized receipt. He just tossed his heavy metal credit card onto the silver tray with a practiced flick of the wrist. 5 minutes later, the sommelier returned to the table. He leaned down, whispering very discreetly into Preston's ear. I could only imagine the exact shade of red Preston's face turned when he heard the word declined. Preston scoffed loudly, attempting to brush it off as a minor inconvenience. He pulled a different platinum card from his designer wallet and handed it to the waiter. He confidently blamed the rejection on international fraud protection, apologizing to my father and the table next to them for the bank being overly cautious with his massive wealth. Calvin chuckled, agreeing that banks were always too strict with high net worth individuals. The waiter returned 2 minutes later, declined again. Sweat began to bead on Preston's forehead, ruining his perfectly styled look. His confident posture completely collapsed. He dug frantically into his wallet, pulling out a third card, a joint account he shared with Chloe. The waiter, losing his discreet demeanor, swiped it right there at the portable terminal near their table. The machine beeped with a harsh, flat rejection that echoed over the soft piano music playing in the background. Now people were definitely staring. The wealthy investors at the next table whispered behind their menus. My mother Beatrice sat completely frozen in her seat, her fake wealthy smile melting away into sheer panic. She frantically checked her reflection in her spoon, terrified of the social embarrassment. My father Calvin looked down at his empty wineglass, the illusion of their grand luxury trip instantly shattering. Panic firmly set in. Preston abruptly excused himself from the table, practically sprinting out through the glass doors to the promenade deck. The tropical wind whipped his hair as he pulled out his phone. Back in Atlanta, I was sitting in my penthouse looking out over the sprawling city skyline when my screen lit up with Preston's name. I let it ring 3 times before finally answering. Maya, I need you to wire me $10,000 right now, Preston demanded the exact second the call connected. There was no greeting. There was no please. There was just the same arrogant entitlement he carried in my parents' living room earlier that day. My bank locked all my primary accounts because we are out of the country and their fraud department is being absolutely ridiculous. I will pay you back the second we dock in Miami with interest. Just do it quickly. I leaned back in my velvet chair and took a slow sip of my drink. $10,000, I asked, feigning absolute shock. Preston, you know I am just a low-level IT help desk worker. How on earth would I have $10,000 lying around? My hourly wage barely covers my rent. Remember, I could not possibly help a wealthy man like you. You said I would embarrass you on this trip, yet you are the one begging for my money. Maya, this is not the time for your petty little games. Preston snapped, his voice rising in genuine panic. We are sitting in a VIP dining room surrounded by very important people. I cannot walk back in there empty-handed and tell them I cannot cover the bill. Just wire the money immediately. You owe us after the terrible attitude you threw at the house today. You are family, and family helps each other. I laughed softly into the receiver. I do not owe you anything, Preston. In fact, I think the $15,000 I already sent was more than enough charity for 1 year. Maybe you should pay for your extravagant dinner with all those real assets you were bragging about this morning. You are the financial genius, so figure it out. I heard scuffling and heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Chloe had clearly followed him out to the dark deck. She snatched the phone directly from his hand. Maya, you are being a vindictive, selfish brat, she screamed, not caring who heard her throwing a tantrum on the ship. Mom and Dad are sitting inside completely humiliated because you will not help your own family. You are trying to ruin their dream vacation just because you are jealous of my marriage and my perfect life. I am not jealous of the man whose credit cards bounce at a dinner table, I replied with absolute calm. And I am certainly not jealous of a marriage built entirely on financial fraud. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic scoff. Fraud Preston is a financial genius. He saved Mom and Dad from losing their house. You are just mad because he knows how to handle massive amounts of money, and you do not understand high-level wealth management. You are just a bitter dropout trying to drag everyone down to your miserable level. I stood up and walked over to my penthouse window, looking down at the tiny cars driving on the streets far below. The cool glass felt good against my hand. If he is such a financial genius, Chloe, why are his cards declining over a $2,000 dinner bill? I asked. The line went dead quiet for a full second. I could hear the ocean waves crashing against the side of the massive ship through the phone speaker. Why do not you use the money Preston took from Dad's retirement fund to pay for your dinner? I asked, keeping my tone light and conversational. Chloe let out a confused, shaky breath. What are you talking about? What retirement fund? We never touched his retirement. I smiled, watching a plane fly across the dark night sky. "Oh, wait," I said softly. "Did he not tell you?" I hung up the phone before Chloe could even form a response. I did not need to hear the inevitable screaming match that was about to erupt on that cruise ship balcony. My part in their tropical nightmare was done for the night. I had a busy morning ahead of me in Atlanta. By 8 o'clock the next morning, a fleet of massive commercial moving trucks rumbled into the quiet cul-de-sac of Cascade Heights. Marcus Sterling did not mess around. He had promised a fast extraction, and he delivered. A crew of 20 burly men swarmed my parents' property, carrying rolls of industrial bubble wrap and heavy-duty black trash bags. I stood on the pristine front lawn, holding a cup of artisan coffee, watching as my mother's custom-upholstered Italian sofas were unceremoniously shoved through the front doors. Cascade Heights was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was also the epicenter of my mother's entire social universe. Beatrice practically ran the First Memorial Cathedral. She was the head of the hospitality committee, the director of the annual charity gala, and the self-appointed queen of Sunday morning fashion. She spent decades looking down her nose at anyone who wore the same dress twice or drove a car that was more than 3 years old. Her entire identity was built on the illusion of flawless generational wealth. It took exactly 14 minutes for the neighborhood watch to mobilize. I saw the curtains twitching next door. Then the front door across the street opened. Sister Eleanor and Sister Martha, my mother's two biggest rivals on the church committee, began a brisk, synchronized power walk across the manicured lawns. They were dressed in their matching pastel morning tracksuits, gripping their bedazzled travel mugs. They looked like two predators smelling fresh blood in the water. "Maya, dear," Sister Eleanor called out, waving a manicured hand as she approached the driveway. Her eyes were darting wildly, trying to take in the sheer volume of furniture being loaded into the unbranded trucks. We saw the commotion and just had to come over. Is Beatrice redecorating again? She just bought that imported dining table for Thanksgiving. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I arranged my face into an expression of absolute cheerful innocence. "Oh, good morning, Sister Eleanor. Sister Martha," I said loudly, ensuring the moving crew and anyone else listening from their porches could hear every single word. "No, Mom is not redecorating. They are actually moving out today, completely downsizing." Sister Martha practically dropped her travel mug. Moving. But Beatrice just told us at choir practice that she was hosting the summer gala right here in the garden. Why on earth would they move so suddenly? I let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, shaking my head as if carrying a terrible burden. "Well, you know how secretive my parents are about their struggles," I said, leaning in closer, as if sharing a confidential prayer request. "Preston advised them to liquidate immediately. He is their wealth manager, you know." Sister Eleanor nodded eagerly, leaning in so close I could smell her peppermint breath mint. "Yes, the brilliant financial guru. Beatrice talks about him every Sunday." "Exactly." I smiled brightly. "Preston is just so brilliant. He realized my father's retirement funds were completely gone, wiped out. Preston told them they could not afford this lifestyle anymore. He lost all their money in some very aggressive investments, and he told Mom and Dad they had to sell the house today to avoid total bankruptcy. So we are packing all this beautiful furniture into cheap storage units. They are going to have to find a tiny rental apartment when they get back from their discount cruise." The silence that followed was spectacular. Sister Eleanor and Sister Martha stared at me, their mouths hanging open in perfect identical O shapes. The illusion of Beatrice, the wealthy, blessed matriarch of the congregation, shattered right in front of my eyes. I could literally see the gears turning in their heads, calculating the exact level of humiliation this would cause my mother. "Oh, my sweet lord," Sister Martha whispered, clutching her pearl necklace. "Penniless Beatrice is penniless, and Preston lost it all." I nodded solemnly. "It is a tragedy. But you know, Mom, she is so brave. She wanted to keep up appearances. She would probably die of absolute shame if the congregation found out she was broke. So please keep this in your prayers. Do not tell a soul." "Of course, Maya," Sister Eleanor said, her eyes gleaming with a vicious kind of joy. "We will form a prayer circle immediately." They did not even wait to walk back to their own houses. Before they reached the end of my driveway, both women had their smartphones out, their thumbs flying across the screens. The church gossip dominoes had officially been tipped over. I knew how the first Memorial Cathedral communication network operated. It was faster than fiber optic internet. Within 10 minutes, the hospitality committee would know. Within 20 minutes, the choir would know. By lunchtime, every single member of the 3,000-person congregation would know that Beatrice and Calvin were broke homeless and scammed by their own precious white son-in-law. I spent the next 2 hours directing the movers, making sure they did not leave a single scrap of my parents' fake legacy behind. The massive crystal chandeliers were boxed up. The custom silk drapes were yanked down. The house was being systematically hollowed out, echoing with the sound of packing tape and heavy boots. Right as the final truck closed its metal doors, my phone began to vibrate in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the caller ID. It was my father. I swiped to answer and held the phone to my ear, not saying a word. Maya Calvin roared into the receiver. His voice was shaking with a level of rage I had never heard from him before. "What is going on back there? Why did Pastor Williams just call my cell phone?" I smiled, walking through the empty, echoing living room. "Pastor Williams, that is so nice of him to check in while you are on vacation. What did he want?" My father was breathing heavily, clearly trying to keep his voice down so the other cruise passengers would not hear him screaming. "He just offered me financial charity," Calvin hissed, the humiliation practically burning through the phone line. "He told me the church board had taken up a special collection for us. He said he was praying for our bankruptcy and asked if we needed access to the church food pantry." "Maya, what did you tell them?" I walked out the front door and locked the deadbolt for the very last time. "I just asked for prayers, Dad," I said smoothly. "Since Preston lost your entire retirement fund, I figured you could use all the divine intervention you can get. Have you checked your bank accounts yet?" The line went dead. I tossed my phone onto the marble desk as the line went dead. Calvin was finally facing the absolute ruin he had allowed into his home. I turned my attention to the array of curved, ultra-high-definition monitors dominating my home office. The Atlanta skyline glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, a fitting backdrop for the empire I had quietly built, while my family treated me like a basement-dwelling tech support drone. They thought I reset passwords for a living. They told their country club friends I was a low-level IT help desk worker because they were embarrassed by my lack of a prestigious title. The truth was drastically different. I was the founder and CEO of Apex Ledger, a multi-million-dollar financial technology platform that handled secure escrow and transaction tracing for Fortune 500 companies. I engineered the software that banks use to track missing millions. I knew exactly how money moved where it hid and how to drag it out into the light. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and cracked my knuckles. It was time to see exactly what Preston had been doing in the dark. I logged into my proprietary tracing network. I had Preston's basic banking information from 3 years ago when I set up the blind limited liability company to buy my parents' debt. He had routed a small, fake administrative fee through a local credit union to make his hero act look legitimate to Calvin. I took that single routing number and fed it into my software. My algorithms bypassed the standard commercial banking firewalls, diving deep into the metadata of his financial footprint. Lines of code and transaction histories began scrolling rapidly across my monitors. I leaned closer to the screens, my eyes tracking the massive outward flow of capital. Preston had presented himself to my family as a conservative wealth manager, a brilliant investor who favored safe long-term corporate bonds. The data told a completely different story. Preston was running a sloppy, desperate Ponzi scheme. I traced the $15,000 he had stolen from my father's remaining liquid cash to fund their luxury Caribbean cruise. The money had not come from a dividend payout like he claimed. He had siphoned it directly from a joint account Calvin had foolishly given him access to. But that was just the loose change. I wanted to see the big picture. I wanted to see my father's entire life savings. I pulled up the records for Calvin's primary retirement portfolio. A year ago, the balance had sat comfortably at just over $2 million. Today, the balance was exactly zero. My hands flew across the keyboard, tracing the massive withdrawals. Preston had not moved the money into overseas real estate or emerging tech stocks. He had wired it in staggered, untraceable increments to a series of offshore cryptocurrency wallets. From there, my software followed the blockchain trail directly to an illicit sports gambling syndicate based out of Las Vegas and Macau. Preston was a degenerate gambler. I pulled up the itemized betting ledgers my software had scraped from the shadow servers. Preston had been betting hundreds of thousands of dollars on college football games, international soccer matches, and underground boxing rings. He was a terrible gambler, constantly chasing massive losses with even bigger, riskier bets. When he ran out of his own money, he started stealing from his clients. When his clients grew suspicious, he drained my father's retirement fund to cover the threats from his bookies. The luxurious suits, the expensive leased cars, the arrogant smirk at the dinner table. It was all a fragile, rotting house of cards built on other people's stolen futures. He had played my parents for absolute fools, feeding them fabricated quarterly statements he probably mocked up in a basic word processor. I hit a key on my dashboard, initiating a mass download of every single damning transaction. My servers pulled the wire transfer receipts, the offshore routing numbers, the gambling ledger histories, and the forged portfolio statements. I watched the progress bar hit 100%. The evidence was irrefutable. It was enough financial crime to put Preston in federal prison for the next 20 years. I saved the master file to an encrypted external drive, a cold sense of satisfaction settling in my chest. I was about to shut down the terminal when an anomalous transaction caught my eye. It was a massive influx of cash that had hit Preston's account just 6 weeks ago. The sum was precisely $400,000. I frowned, isolating the specific wire transfer. Preston did not have any clients left with that kind of liquidity. I ran the origin routing number through the property database, cross-referencing it with regional county clerk records. The origin was a mortgage lender. I opened the loan origination document, reading the address attached to the loan. My blood ran cold. It was Chloe's address. The beautiful, sprawling 5-bedroom colonial home in the suburbs that Chloe endlessly bragged about on her social media pages. The house my parents had proudly helped them secure the down payment for. Preston had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on his own marital home. He had leveraged the entire equity of the house to pay off a brutal gambling debt. I scanned the payment history on the new loan. The first payment had bounced. The second payment had bounced. The grace period had officially expired yesterday. A bright red status marker flashed on my screen next to the property deed. Default. Imminent foreclosure. Preston had not just ruined my parents, he had financially destroyed my sister. Chloe was sitting on a luxury cruise ship, live streaming her fake wealthy aesthetic to the world, completely unaware that the bank was currently filing the paperwork to seize her home and lock her out on the street. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the flashing red default notice. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was an unknown number, but the area code belonged to the cruise line's international maritime network. They were desperate. The dominoes were falling, and I held the only map to the wreckage. The Caribbean sun was beating down on the pristine teak deck of the luxury liner, but the temperature inside the ship's elite Lotus Spa had just plummeted to freezing. Beatrice stood at the marble reception desk, wrapped in a plush, monogrammed robe, a look of utter indignation plastered across her face. She had spent the last hour bragging to the wives of 2 foreign diplomats in the sauna about her sprawling estate in Atlanta and her brilliant son-in-law. She had confidently marched up to the counter to book a $2,000 package of gold-infused facials and deep tissue massages for the rest of the week. The spa attendant, a perfectly poised woman with a tight smile, slid the heavy platinum card back across the marble counter. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Washington," the attendant whispered, leaning forward to keep her voice down. "Your card has been declined. Would you like to provide an alternative method of payment?" Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. She snatched the card back, her hands shaking slightly. "There must be a mistake with your machine," she snapped, her voice carrying a little too loudly in the serene, incense-scented room. "Run this one. It is my husband's premium account." She threw a different card onto the counter. The attendant swiped it. The machine chimed with a flat, rejecting tone. "Declined again, ma'am. the attendant said, her professional smile slipping into something resembling pity. Beatrice could feel the eyes of the other wealthy patrons burning into her back. The hushed whispers of the diplomats' wives echoed in the quiet lobby. She grabbed both cards, her face burning with a fiery, uncontainable humiliation, and marched out of the spa without another word. She practically ran down the carpeted hallway back to her stateroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside the stateroom, Calvin was pacing the floor, looking like a man who had just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. He held his cell phone gripped tightly to his ear, his knuckles white. After the humiliating phone call from their pastor offering them food pantry charity, Calvin had finally bypassed Preston and called his investment bank directly. He had spent 45 agonizing minutes on hold with the fraud department, praying that Maya was just playing a cruel, vindictive trick. "I do not understand," Calvin said into the phone, his voice cracking. "What do you mean the balance is zero? I had over $2 million in that portfolio. I have been building that fund for 30 years. The bank representative on the other end of the line was polite but firm. "I am looking at the wire transfers right now, Mr. Washington." The funds were fully liquidated and transferred out in a series of staggered offshore wires over the last 8 months. The transactions were all authorized by your designated wealth manager, Preston Sterling. Your current balance is $0.00. Calvin dropped the phone. It hit the plush carpet with a dull thud. His legs gave out and he sank onto the edge of the bed, putting his head in his hands. 30 years of grinding work, of saving, of building a legacy for his family, completely vaporized. Everything Maya had said was true. "Where is he?" Calvin growled, his shock rapidly morphing into a blinding, consuming rage. He stood up, completely ignoring Beatrice as she walked in crying about her spa treatments. "Where is that lying thief?" Calvin stormed out of the cabin, marching through the ship with a singular, furious focus. He found Preston and Chloe lounging in a private cabana by the adults-only infinity pool. They were sipping colorful cocktails, completely relaxed, posing for another one of Chloe's endless social media updates. Calvin shoved past a waiter and stood directly over Preston's lounge chair, blocking the sun. "Where is my money, Preston?" Calvin roared, not caring at all about the startled looks from the wealthy passengers lounging nearby. "I just got off the phone with the bank. My retirement account is empty. $2 million is gone." Preston did not even flinch. He slowly lowered his sunglasses, looking up at Calvin with an expression of mild, patronizing annoyance. "Calvin, please lower your voice," Preston said smoothly, sitting up and adjusting his expensive linen shirt. "You are causing a scene over a simple misunderstanding of market mechanics." "Misunderstanding?" Calvin yelled, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. "The bank said you wired it all offshore. You stole my life savings." Preston let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, looking at Calvin like he was a slow child who could not grasp basic addition. "I did not steal anything, Calvin. Your portfolio was heavily weighted in outdated, stagnant assets. I simply leveraged your capital into high-yield, aggressive offshore markets to maximize your returns. We are experiencing some short-term market fluctuations, and the assets are currently illiquid. It is standard, high-level finance." Preston stood up, stepping closer to Calvin and lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "The only reason we are having cash flow issues on this trip is because Maya is being a petty, unsupportive brat. I asked her to wire a temporary bridge loan to cover the gap while the offshore funds settle, and she flat out refused. If your daughter wasn't so aggressively bitter about my success, we would not be having this conversation." Calvin stared at him, absolutely completely stunned by the sheer audacity of the deflection. "You drain my entire life savings and you are blaming Maya." "Dad, stop yelling at my husband," Chloe snapped, standing up and stepping between them. She crossed her arms, glaring at her father. "Preston is trying to double your money and you are out here screaming like a crazy person. You and Mom just do not understand high-level wealth management. You are embarrassing us in front of everyone." Calvin looked at his daughter, his own flesh and blood, defending the man who had just financially ruined their entire family. She was choosing the aesthetic, the proximity to whiteness, the illusion of elite wealth over her own parents' survival. Before Calvin could unleash the fury building in his chest, a sharp, authoritative throat clearing interrupted them. A man in a crisp white maritime uniform stood at the edge of their cabana. He was the ship's chief concierge, and he was flanked by two large, imposing security officers. He held a tablet in his hand, and his face was entirely devoid of the cheerful customer service smile he usually wore. "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling, Mr. and Mrs. Washington," the concierge said, his voice carrying clearly over the gentle splash of the infinity pool. "I am afraid we have a very serious situation. The credit cards associated with your onboard accounts have just been flagged by an international banking authority for severe fraudulent activity." Chloe dropped her cocktail glass. It shattered against the teak deck, splashing bright red liquid across Preston's expensive shoes. "What are you talking about?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. "We are VIP guests." "Not anymore, ma'am," the concierge said coldly, stepping back as the security officers stepped forward. "Due to the fraud alerts, the cruise line has immediately frozen all of your room key cards and suspended your onboard spending privileges. Furthermore, the airline has just contacted us. Your first-class return flights to Atlanta have been officially canceled by the carrier due to bounced payments. You are required to vacate this cabana immediately, and you will need to find your own way home when we dock tomorrow." The sharp buzzing of my phone broke the absolute silence of my penthouse office. The caller ID flashed on the sleek glass screen. It was my mother. The luxury ship had officially docked at the port in Florida, and reality had finally caught up with them. I let the phone vibrate against the mahogany desk, watching her perfectly airbrushed contact photo light up the room. She called 3 times in rapid succession before I finally reached out and swiped the green accept button. I did not say a word. I just sat back in my ergonomic leather chair and listened. The background noise filtering through the speaker was absolute chaos. I could hear the harsh industrial blare of cruise terminal announcements, the loud rumbling of diesel luggage carts, and the unmistakable sound of Chloe sobbing hysterically in the background. "Maya! Maya, are you there?" Beatrice's voice came through the line, completely stripped of its usual aristocratic velvet. She was hyperventilating, her breath hitching with genuine panic. "You have to help us. It is a complete disaster down here." "Good morning, Mother," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. "How was the rest of your luxury vacation? Did you enjoy the VIP cabana? They threw us out." "Maya," Beatrice wailed, completely ignoring my sarcasm. "They escorted us down the gangway with security guards. People were pointing their phones at us. Sister Eleanor's friends were standing right on the upper deck watching us get marched off the ship like common criminals. Your father is sitting on a concrete bench clutching his chest, and Preston's bank accounts are entirely frozen." The airline sent an automated message saying our first-class return flights were canceled for insufficient funds. I took a slow sip of my coffee, relishing the rich, dark roast. That sounds like a terrible misunderstanding of market mechanics. Preston is a financial genius. Remember, I am sure he can leverage his high-yield assets to buy you a flight. "Maya, please," my mother pleaded, her tone shifting gears violently. She dropped the panic and attempted to coat her words in a thick layer of maternal sweetness. "Maya, darling, my sweet firstborn, I know we have had our misunderstandings lately, but we are family. You are the only one who can fix this. You work in technology. You understand how these computer systems operate. Just use your tech connections to bypass this silly fraud alert, or use whatever airline miles you have to book us 4 first-class tickets back to Atlanta. I cannot spend another minute standing on this humid concrete pier smelling like diesel fuel." I actually smiled at the phone. Even completely stranded, publicly humiliated, and financially ruined, my mother was still demanding first-class accommodations. She truly believed my job in the tech industry was some sort of underground hacking ring where I could magically manipulate airline databases. "My tech connections?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "You mean my little help desk job? The career you told your church committee was an absolute embarrassment to the family name." I never said that. Beatrice lied instantly, her voice pitching up an octave. "You are twisting my words. You are being overly sensitive, just like always. Please, Maya. We are desperate." If we are family, and if you want my help, then you are going to tell me the truth right now. I said, my voice dropping, losing all traces of humor. Why was I actually left off this trip? I told you, Beatrice stammered, clearly caught off guard by the sudden interrogation. The resort accommodations were limited. There was not enough room in the dining party. Do not lie to me, I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip. I traced digital footprints for a living. I saw the social media tags, Mother. I know Preston's mother flew down from Palm Beach to meet you in the Bahamas. I know she joined you for the second leg of the cruise. You kicked me off the trip, your own daughter, because you wanted to impress her. You wanted to play the role of the flawless billionaire matriarch, and you decided your single independent daughter who works in tech did not fit the aesthetic. Admit it. The line went dead quiet. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the distant blast of a cargo ship horn echoing through the receiver. When Beatrice finally spoke, the artificial sweetness was entirely gone. Her voice was cold, venomous, and dripping with long-held resentment. Fine, Beatrice snarled, her fierce pride completely overriding her desperation. You want the truth. You are difficult, Maya. You refuse to dress the part. You refuse to play the social game, and you constantly look down on Preston. His mother comes from generational wealth. She expects a certain level of class and sophistication. You walk around with that smug, judgmental look on your face, acting like you are better than all of us just because you pay your own bills. I was protecting our family's reputation. I was not going to let you embarrass us in front of high society. There it is, I whispered. A profound sense of closure washed over me. The final fraying string tying me to her toxic approval simply snapped. For years I had twisted myself into knots, trying to be the supportive daughter paying their debts, preserving their dignity, and accepting their casual cruelty. But hearing her say the words aloud finally set me free. I am your mother! Beatrice demanded, her voice rising to a frantic shriek, sensing that she had just lost whatever leverage she thought she possessed. I gave you life. You owe me those flights. Book the tickets right now. I will get you a ride home, I said quietly. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting off her screaming instantly. The silence in my penthouse returned beautifully heavy and absolute. I turned back to my ultra-high-definition monitors and opened a new browser window. I did not navigate to Delta. I did not search for private charters. I typed in the web address for Greyhound. I quickly located the bus terminal closest to their exact port in Florida. I selected the cheapest, longest route available from Miami to Atlanta. It was a brutal 15-hour overnight ride featuring 4 different layovers and no direct transfers. I navigated to the seat selection map. I deliberately clicked on 4 seats located at the very back of the bus, directly next to the chemical toilet. I typed in my payment information and clicked purchase. The confirmation screen appeared, displaying 4 digital boarding passes. I downloaded the receipt, attached it to a text message, and sent it to the family group chat. Safe travels, I typed. Do not forget to pack your own snacks. The loud mechanical rumble of diesel engines vibrated through the pavement before the trucks even turned the corner. I stood leaning against the hood of my car, parked directly across the street from my parents' property. The heavy, suffocating weight of familial obligation that usually pressed down on my chest whenever I visited Cascade Heights was entirely gone. I was standing in my past, but for the very first time I held absolutely all of the power. The house across the street already looked pathetic. Stripped of its custom-imported furniture, the heavy silk drapes, and the glowing crystal chandeliers. It was just an empty hollow shell of drywall and staggering debt. The neighborhood watch was on maximum alert. Sister Eleanor and Sister Martha were stationed at the edge of the adjacent driveway. They had traded their pastel morning tracksuits for matching floral blouses, clearly treating this spectacle as the social event of the season. The church gossip network had been running at full capacity since I tipped the first domino yesterday morning. They were waiting for a show, and the corporate developer who bought the foreclosed property was about to give them a spectacular one. 2 massive flatbed trucks rolled into the quiet, tree-lined cul-de-sac, carrying heavy-duty yellow excavators and a wrecking bulldozer. The deafening roar of the machinery shattered the serene, manicured silence of the neighborhood. Sister Eleanor practically jogged across the street toward me, her eyes wide with frantic curiosity. "Maya, what on earth is happening here?" she demanded, gesturing wildly at the construction vehicles. "I thought you said they were just moving their things into cheap storage. Why are there bulldozers driving onto Beatrice's award-winning lawn?" I kept my arms casually crossed over my chest and offered her a serene, untroubled smile. "Well, Sister Eleanor, since Preston lost absolutely all their money, the bank had to liquidate the asset immediately. A corporate developer bought the land this morning. They do not want the house. They are tearing it down to build high-density luxury townhomes." Sister Eleanor gasped loudly, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. "Tearing it down Beatrice's beautiful home. But the neighborhood association will never allow multifamily units here. I think the bank's federal foreclosure division outranks the neighborhood association," I replied smoothly. We turned our attention back to the property as the heavy machinery rolled off the flatbeds. The massive metal treads of the excavator tore violently into the pristine Bermuda grass my father had spent thousands of dollars maintaining. The operator maneuvered the towering machine directly in front of the grand two-story portico. He sounded a short, sharp blast of the horn. The giant steel claw swung forward with terrifying momentum. It crashed directly into the pristine white columns framing the front door. The structural supports snapped like dry toothpicks. A deafening crack echoed through the neighborhood as the entire front overhang collapsed downward in a violent cascade of shattered wood, crushed brick, and broken glass. I stood completely still on the sidewalk watching the destruction unfold. Every brutal swing of the excavator arm felt like a profound physical release. This house was not just a building, it was the ultimate monument to my family's lies. It was the fortress where my mother curated her fake legacy, where she judged the entire congregation, where she made me feel small and insignificant because I refused to play her shallow games. It was a physical manifestation of their toxic pride, and now it was being systematically ripped apart. The machine tore into the second floor, ripping the roof clean off the master bedroom. Drywall crumpled, insulation rained down like dirty snow, and a massive cloud of thick gray plaster dust billowed high into the air. The dust drifted across the street, coating the pristine lawns and settling lightly onto Sister Eleanor's floral blouse. She coughed, backing away in horror, but I did not move an inch. I let the dust wash over me. The illusion was entirely dead. The fake generational wealth had been completely pulverized into debris. The roar of the diesel engines and the sound of collapsing architecture was deafening, but it did not mask the sudden aggressive screech of heavy tires. Through the thick, swirling cloud of plaster dust, two sleek black Chevrolet Suburbans abruptly pulled into the cul-de-sac. They drove erratically, jumping the curb and blocking the street entirely. Their hidden grille lights were flashing brilliant red and blue. The doors of both vehicles swung open in perfect, rigid unison. 6 people stepped out onto the pavement. They were not local Atlanta police officers. They moved with strict tactical precision. They were wearing dark windbreakers with stark, bold yellow lettering printed across their backs. FBI. SEC. Sister Eleanor let out a terrified squeak and scurried back to her own property line, retreating behind a large oak tree to watch safely from a distance. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a severe expression, ignored the demolition crew, the falling house, and the panic-stricken neighbors. He walked straight through the settling dust cloud, his eyes locking directly onto me. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to flash a heavy gold federal badge. He did not ask about the house getting ripped to shreds behind us. He did not ask about my parents. "Are you Maya Washington?" The agent asked, his voice cutting clearly through the mechanical noise of the wrecking ball. "We are looking for Preston Sterling. We have federal warrants for his immediate arrest regarding massive wire fraud, interstate gambling syndicates, and embezzlement. Where is he?" "I am Maya Washington," I said, keeping my posture completely relaxed while the heavy machinery continued to tear into my childhood home. "And you can put your handcuffs away for the moment." Preston Sterling is currently somewhere near the Georgia border, riding in the very back of a discount commercial bus. He will arrive at the downtown Atlanta terminal tonight at exactly 8:15. Agent Vance did not smile. He signaled to the other agents, who immediately lowered their hands from their service weapons and fanned out to secure a perimeter around the SUVs. Sister Eleanor let out another faint gasp from behind her oak tree, practically vibrating with the urge to pull out her phone and start dialing the church prayer chain. "We have been building a federal case against your brother-in-law for the last 11 months, Vance said, his eyes scanning my face for any sign of complicity. "He is running a massive interstate Ponzi scheme. He has been liquidating client assets to cover illicit gambling debts. We had him boxed in, but 2 days ago he managed to move $400,000 through a highly encrypted proprietary digital escrow channel. We traced the architecture of that transaction layer. It belongs to Apex Ledger. It belongs to you." Vance stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hard, authoritative register. "We know you are the CEO, Ms. Washington. We know you built the encryption protocols. Preston used your software to launder federal evidence. We need your full, immediate cooperation, or we are going to be having a very different conversation down at the federal building." I reached into the front pocket of my tailored blazer. Two of the junior agents immediately tensed their hands, twitching toward their belts. I slowly pulled out a small, heavy titanium flash drive and held it up in the bright morning sunlight. "You do not need a subpoena, Agent Vance, and you certainly do not need to threaten me," I said smoothly. "I discovered his unauthorized use of my platform at 6 o'clock this morning. My system flagged an anomalous offshore routing sequence. Preston attempted to use an automated clearinghouse loophole in my software to mask a massive wire transfer, but he is fundamentally incompetent when it comes to deep-level encryption." I tossed the flash drive. Vance caught it easily, looking down at the small piece of metal with a mixture of suspicion and surprise. "Everything you need is on that drive," I told him, keeping my voice loud enough for the neighborhood watch to hear every single word. "The drive is unencrypted. You will find the complete offshore routing numbers, the metadata for his shadow accounts, and the exact digital addresses for the illegal gambling syndicates he owes money to in Macau and Las Vegas. I also included the forged quarterly portfolio statements he has been feeding to his clients. You have his entire operation mapped out down to the exact second he executed the fraudulent transfers." Vance stared at me, the hard edge of his professional suspicion slowly melting into absolute astonishment. He looked at the flash drive, then back at my calm, unbothered expression. "You cracked his entire digital laundering operation in one morning?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "We have had a team of forensic accountants working on this for almost a year." "Your accountants are looking at the money," I replied, brushing a speck of plaster dust off my lapel. "I look at the code. Money lies. Code does not." I also included the paperwork for a fraudulent second mortgage he secretly took out on his marital home to cover his most recent gambling losses. The bank is currently foreclosing on the property. My sister has absolutely no idea she is essentially homeless. Behind me, the bulldozer let out a massive groaning roar as it pushed the remaining half of the colonial facade into a pile of shattered bricks. The loud crash punctuated my sentence perfectly. Vance pocketed the titanium drive. He nodded slowly, a look of genuine respect crossing his features. "I appreciate your swift cooperation, Ms. Washington. You just saved the federal government thousands of man-hours. We have agents stationed at the airport waiting for their original flight. But since you say they are arriving by bus, I will redirect the tactical unit. We will swarm the downtown terminal and take him into custody the second he steps off that Greyhound." I looked at the smoking, dusty crater where my mother's fake kingdom used to stand. I pictured Beatrice, Calvin, Chloe, and Preston dragging their heavy designer luggage off a commercial bus, smelling of chemical toilets and stale diesel exhaust. I pictured them looking around the grimy terminal, fully expecting to hail a luxury black car to bring them back to their untouched suburban paradise. "Agent Vance," I said, taking a step closer to the federal investigator, "I have handed you a neatly wrapped, irrefutable federal case. I just saved your entire department months of tedious litigation. I am going to ask you for a single personal favor in return." Vance raised a wary eyebrow. "We do not do favors regarding federal fugitives, Ms. Washington." I am not asking you to let him go, I said softly, my eyes locking onto his. I am asking you to wait. Do not arrest him at the bus station. It is too chaotic. It is too anonymous. If you take him at the terminal, my parents and my sister will spend the next 10 years claiming they were the victims of a random, sudden federal overreach. They will spin a narrative that Preston was targeted unfairly. They need to understand the absolute reality of what he has done to them. Vance crossed his arms. And how do you propose we do that without risking him fleeing the jurisdiction? He is not going to flee, I assured him. He has no money, his credit cards are frozen, and his passport has a federal flag on it. He is going to cling to my parents because they are the last people on earth who still believe his lies. Let them get off the bus. Let them order a cheap rideshare. Put an unmarked tail on them from the terminal. I gestured toward the roaring excavators leveling the back half of the property. Let them drive all the way back to Cascade Heights. Let them pull into this cul-de-sac expecting to walk through their custom mahogany front doors. I want my mother to see this empty dirt lot. I want my father to realize his entire life savings paid for an illusion. I want my sister to stand on this sidewalk and realize her brilliant, wealthy husband is nothing but a cheap, degenerate thief. I held Vance's gaze, refusing to blink. Let them see the wreckage first. Then you can put the handcuffs on him. Vance looked at the construction crew actively grinding my family's legacy into dust. He looked at Sister Eleanor, who was currently whispering frantically into her cell phone behind the oak tree. Finally, he looked back at me, a slow, tight smile forming on his face. We will establish a rolling surveillance perimeter at the bus terminal. Vance agreed, his voice low. We will follow them back to this address. But the second they step out of their vehicle, we are moving in. That is exactly what I'm counting on, I replied. 400 miles south of the demolition site, my carefully selected Greyhound bus was barreling up the Florida Turnpike. The interior of the cabin was a brutal, relentless assault on the senses. The air conditioning was broken, leaving the packed bus stiflingly hot and thick with the overwhelming scent of stale diesel exhaust, cheap body spray, and the unmistakable lingering odor of the chemical toilet located just inches from their assigned seats in the very back row. Chloe was wedged against the vibrating window, actively hyperventilating. Her custom silk resort wear designed for lounging on private yacht decks was completely inappropriate for the sticky vinyl seats. She had spent the first 3 hours of the journey sobbing loudly, much to the annoyance of the exhausted commuters around them. She kept frantically waving her hand in front of her face, desperately trying to fan away the smell of the bathroom every time the flimsy plastic door swung open. I cannot breathe in here. Chloe gasped, her voice shrill and grating over the loud rumble of the bus tires. The floor is sticky. Someone spilled soda on my Gucci sandals. Preston, you have to make the driver pull over. You have to buy us a rental car right now. Beatrice was entirely unresponsive to her youngest daughter's breakdown. She was huddled in the aisle seat, her face completely obscured by a massive, floppy Prada sun hat. She had her oversized designer sunglasses pushed up high on her nose, despite the dim, flickering fluorescent lighting of the bus interior. She sat completely rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, terrified that her shoulder might brush against the sleeping stranger across the aisle. She was paralyzed by absolute mortification. The matriarch of high society, a woman who strictly flew first class, was currently sitting next to a lavatory on a discount commercial bus. She refused to speak. She refused to eat the stale vending machine crackers Preston had managed to scrape together. She was simply pretending she did not exist. Directly in front of them sat Calvin and Preston. The dynamic between the once proud patriarch and his golden son-in-law had completely deteriorated into a toxic, suffocating silence. Calvin stared straight ahead at the torn gray fabric of the seat in front of him. His jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. The initial shock of being publicly humiliated and escorted off the luxury cruise ship by armed security was rapidly wearing off. In its place was a deep, dangerous, and simmering rage. Calvin was a man who prided himself on control, on wealth, and on dominance. Now his bank accounts were frozen, his credit cards were declining, and he was trapped on a public bus because he could not even afford a plane ticket. Next to him, Preston was a catastrophic mess. He was sweating profusely, dark, wet patches blooming under the arms of his expensive, wrinkled linen shirt. His hands shook uncontrollably as he repeatedly pressed the power button on his dead smartphone. His battery had died somewhere outside of Orlando, completely severing his connection to his offshore accounts. Preston knew he was out of time. He knew his digital escrow laundering channels were failing. He knew his offshore transfers were freezing, and he knew with terrifying certainty that my sudden, uncharacteristic gesture to book them a bus ride was not an act of charity. It was a deliberate, calculated trap. He was a cornered animal frantically running out of options. "Preston, do something?" Chloe whined again, aggressively kicking the back of his seat with her ruined designer sandal. "I am starving. I am sweating. Call your bank. Call your broker. Fix this. Shut up, Chloe." Preston snapped, his voice cracking with absolute panic. He turned in his seat, his usual smooth, arrogant charm completely eradicated. "Just shut up for 5 minutes. I cannot fix anything while I am trapped in this metal tube." Calvin slowly turned his head. His eyes were cold hard and entirely devoid of the paternal affection he usually reserved for Preston. "Do not ever speak to my daughter that way again," Calvin growled, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "You are the reason we are on this bus. You are the reason my accounts are locked. You told me those investments were guaranteed. You told me the federal flags were just a routine audit." "It is a misunderstanding," Calvin Preston stammered, his eyes darting nervously around the crowded bus. "The market shifted. The compliance officers are just being overly aggressive. As soon as I get a charger and make a few calls, I will clear the holds. I promise you the money is safe." Calvin did not blink. "You better hope so, Preston. Because if I find out you lost my retirement, I will ruin you myself." The suffocating tension held for another grueling 4 hours, until the bus finally pulled into a desolate, neon-lit truck stop just across the Georgia state line for a mandatory 30-minute driver swap. The harsh fluorescent lights of the gas station cut through the dark, rainy night. The passengers eagerly filed out to stretch their legs, grab cheap coffee, and use real restrooms. Preston practically sprinted off the bus. He muttered something to Chloe about finding a phone charger inside the convenience store. But as soon as his feet hit the wet pavement, his eyes bypassed the brightly lit store entirely. He looked toward the edge of the sprawling parking lot where a line of long-haul semi-trucks idled near the highway on-ramp. Panic completely overrode his logic. He could not go back to Atlanta. He could not face the banks. He had the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist and a platinum wedding band. He figured he could bribe a trucker to take him west, away from the jurisdiction, away from his ruined marriage, and away from the federal agents he suspected were already closing in. Preston slipped his collar up against the cold rain and began walking briskly toward the shadows at the edge of the lot, his pace quickening into a desperate jog. He kept his head down, weaving between the parked cars, hoping the darkness would hide his escape. He made it exactly 50 feet before a massive, heavy hand clamped down violently onto the back of his expensive linen shirt. Preston choked as he was violently jerked backward. His feet slipped on the wet asphalt and he slammed hard against the cold brick wall of the gas station. He looked up, his eyes wide with sheer terror. Calvin stood over him, his face twisted in absolute fury. The older man's grip on Preston's collar was like a steel vise twisting the fabric so tightly it cut off Preston's air supply. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" Calvin snarled, pinning the younger man against the damp brick. "I was just getting some air." Preston wheezed, his hands scrambling uselessly against Calvin's iron grip. "Let me go, Calvin, you spineless coward." Calvin spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You lost my money. You humiliated my family. And now you think you can just run away in the middle of the night and leave us holding the bag." Calvin forcefully shoved Preston away from the wall, practically lifting him off his feet, and marched him aggressively back toward the idling Greyhound. "You are not running away from this. You are going to get back on that bus. You are going to ride it all the way to Atlanta, and you are going to look me in the eye when you explain to the bank exactly what you did with my money. Get on the bus." Calvin stopped dead in his tracks. The raw fury radiating from him seemed to hit an invisible brick wall. His arm dropped slowly to his side as he stared at me, his eyes narrowing in total confusion. He looked at my calm expression, then over my shoulder at the flattened dirt lot, and finally back to me. My house. Calvin echoed the words, tasting like poison on his tongue. What kind of sick joke are you playing, Maya? You do not have the capital to buy a property in this zip code. I did not argue with him. I simply reached into the inner breast pocket of my blazer and pulled out a thick, formally bound sheaf of legal documents. The heavy parchment paper was stamped with the raised, undeniable seal of the Fulton County Clerk of Superior Court. I stepped forward, bypassing my security detail just enough to hand the packet directly to my father. I suggest you skip to the third page, I said smoothly. The signature lines are quite illuminating. Calvin snatched the documents from my hand. His eyes scanned the dense legal text, his lips moving silently as he processed the information. I watched the exact moment the realization hit him. The angry crimson flush instantly drained from his cheeks, leaving his face a sickly, chalky white. His hands began to tremble so violently, the heavy paper rattled in his grip. 3 years ago, I explained, keeping my voice loud and clear over the grinding roar of the excavators behind me. Your brilliant son-in-law suffered his first major unrecoverable loss at the tables in Macau. He drained your liquid cash reserves and defaulted on the primary mortgage. The bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings. You had exactly 30 days before the county sheriff was scheduled to lock you out of these front doors. Calvin slowly looked up from the papers. His breathing was shallow and erratic. Preston told me he was restructuring the mortgage to leverage our equity for a high-yield tax shelter. Calvin whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming authority. He said he handled it. He handled nothing, I replied sharply. He intercepted the bank notices and lied to your face. He was perfectly willing to let you and Mother get thrown out onto the street. I found out through an automated flag on my financial escrow platform. So instead of letting my parents face complete public ruin, I stepped in. I paid off the defaulted debt entirely. I bought the title directly from the bank holding the note. I have owned the dirt you are standing on for the last 3 years. The heavy machinery crashed into the remaining pile of brick and mortar behind me, sending another massive cloud of dust into the humid air. I let you live here rent-free. I continued, my eyes locked on Calvin. I let you keep your country club memberships and your luxury cars, believing you were still masters of your own universe. Preston knew the truth. He knew I saved you. But he begged me to keep it a secret so he could maintain his golden boy status. He told you he executed a brilliant financial maneuver, and you believed him because you wanted to believe him. You wanted to believe your high society son-in-law was a genius, and your independent daughter was a failure. Calvin slowly turned his head. He looked at Preston. Preston was practically vibrating with terror. His expensive clothes were ruined, his face slick with panic sweat, and he looked like a cornered rat. Seeing Calvin's deadly gaze fixed upon him, Preston immediately went on the defensive. He threw his hands up in a frantic, desperate gesture, resorting to the only weapon he had left. Calvin, do not listen to her. Preston shouted, his voice cracking violently. This is a gross misrepresentation of a highly complex, leveraged buyout. She is manipulating the optics of a standard collateralized debt obligation. It was a strategic asset relocation to mitigate capital gains exposure. She forged those transfer records to confuse you. It is a fake document. Calvin did not say a word. He just stared at the pathetic, sweating man in front of him. The corporate jargon, the buzzwords, the endless financial doublespeak Preston had used to manipulate my father for a decade finally sounded exactly like what it was. Pure, unfiltered garbage. Suddenly, a frantic splashing sound broke the tension. Beatrice scrambled up from the mud, her silk blouse stained brown and her knees completely ruined. She shoved past Calvin, her face streaked with mascara and tears. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, as she marched right up to my security perimeter. She pointed a mud-caked finger directly at my face, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic denial. I am your mother! Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing wildly across the street. I demand that you stop this construction right now. Call off those machines. You will call the county clerk, you will transfer this deed back into our name, and you will rebuild my home. You are going to fix this. Give the house back right now. I looked at the woman who had birthed me. Even standing in a literal puddle of mud surrounded by the pulverized ruins of her fake empire, her husband broken, and her golden son-in-law exposed as a massive fraud, she still believed she was in charge. She still believed she could command me to fix her mistakes. The aristocratic delusion was so deeply embedded in her bones that she genuinely could not process the reality of her own destruction. I looked at her with absolute unwavering calm. I reached into my blazer pocket one final time. I pulled out a single folded sheet of standard white printer paper. I extended my arm past the security guards and handed it directly to her. I cannot do that, Mother, I said quietly. But here is the address to the storage unit with your clothes. The rent is due tomorrow. Beatrice stared down at the crisp white sheet of paper in her trembling hands. The address of a discount public storage facility on the outskirts of the city was printed in stark, unfeeling black ink. Her mouth opened and closed silently, her mind completely unable to process the total annihilation of her social standing. She simply knelt there in the wet red clay, a broken queen deposed from her non-existent throne. Chloe, however, did not freeze. The sight of her mother collapsing in the dirt, combined with the smug, impenetrable calm radiating from me, triggered a violent, hysterical break in my younger sister. "You sick, twisted witch!" Chloe shrieked, her voice tearing through the humid night air. She lunged forward, her ruined Gucci sandals sinking deep into the mud with every frantic step. My private security contractors instantly stepped forward, their hands resting firmly on their tactical belts, ready to intercept the threat. I simply raised a single finger. The guards halted, maintaining their defensive perimeter, but allowing Chloe to approach within striking distance. I was not afraid of her. I had never been afraid of her. Chloe stopped inches from my face. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving tears of absolute fury, carving tracks through her expensive makeup. "You are just jealous!" Chloe screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly between my eyes. "You have always been jealous of me. You are a bitter, lonely, unloved woman. I have a beautiful life. I have a husband who adores me. You have nothing but your spite. You are trying to destroy my perfect marriage because nobody will ever want you." I looked at her flushed, twisted face. She was clinging to the very last shred of her carefully curated identity. Her golden child status, her flawless marriage, her ultimate superiority over the outcast sister. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I simply reached back into the thick legal folder in my hand and extracted a second document, this one printed on heavy yellow parchment. "Your perfect marriage," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, razor-sharp whisper. "Take a very close look at what your perfect husband has been building, Chloe." I thrust the document into her chest. She reflexively grabbed it, her eyes darting down to the bold capitalized letters spanning the top of the page. It was a notice of default, an intent to foreclose. But it was not for the demolished estate behind us. The address printed on the legal filing was for a luxury 6-bedroom property in the exclusive Buckhead district. It was Chloe and Preston's house. "What is this?" Chloe stammered, all the venom instantly draining from her voice, replaced by a hollow, breathless confusion. "Our mortgage is paid. Preston handles the mortgage." "Preston handled everything," I corrected her coldly. "When his offshore accounts started freezing 3 weeks ago, he panicked. He needed liquid cash immediately to cover his margin calls and keep his creditors from breaking his kneecaps. So he took out a massive predatory second mortgage on your house. He drained every single cent of equity you had to save his own skin. The bank is seizing your property on Friday." Chloe shook her head rapidly, her wet hair sticking to her face. "No," she whispered, her eyes frantically scanning the document. "No, that is impossible. You need both signatures for a second mortgage. I never signed anything. I would know if I signed this." I stepped closer, invading her space, forcing her to look me in the eye. I know you did not sign it, Chloe. Preston forged your signature. Your perfect, adoring husband bled you completely dry, committed federal fraud, and threw you to the wolves without a second thought. The silence that fell over the dirt lot was absolute. The only sound was the low, steady rumble of my idling Maybach across the street. Chloe slowly, mechanically turned her head. Preston was backed up against the rusted side of the taxicab. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes darting wildly as he searched for a way out. But my security blocked the front. Calvin blocked the street, and the heavy chain-link fence blocked his rear. He was trapped. Chloe baby Preston stammered, holding his hands up in a placating, desperate gesture. It is not what it looks like. It was a temporary liquidity issue. I was bridging a gap. I was going to put the equity back before the end of the fiscal quarter. She is twisting the narrative. Chloe closed the distance between them in 3 massive strides. She did not yell. She did not ask for an explanation. She simply planted her feet in the mud, drew her arm back, and slapped Preston across the face with every ounce of strength in her body. The crack of her palm connecting with his cheek echoed like a gunshot. Preston stumbled backward, crying out as his head slammed against the taxi window. He clutched his rapidly swelling face, his eyes watering from the sheer force of the blow. "You stole from me!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking into a guttural sob. "You stole my house!" The slap did something to Preston. The impact shattered the carefully constructed, polished Ivy League facade he had maintained for a decade. The smooth, charming corporate executive vanished instantly, replaced by something incredibly ugly, vicious, and entirely unhinged. Preston dropped his hand from his cheek. He stood up straight, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. He spat a glob of blood onto the wet pavement and glared at Chloe, then at Calvin, and finally at Beatrice, who was still weeping on the ground. "You think I actually wanted to be part of this circus?" Preston exploded, his voice dripping with venomous disgust. "You people are a joke. You are loud, obnoxious, uncultured trash trying to buy your way into rooms you do not even belong in." Calvin took a menacing step forward, his fists balled, but Preston did not back down. He was completely unglued, riding a wave of adrenaline and absolute exposure. "You needed me!" Preston yelled, jabbing a finger at Calvin. "You were so desperate for validation. You wanted a son-in-law with the right pedigree, the right background, the right skin color to make your little new money empire look legitimate to the old money elite. You wanted to sit at the tables at the country club and look like you were born to be there instead of looking like lucky upstarts who just stumbled into a pile of cash." Chloe covered her mouth, stepping back as if physically struck by his words. "I did not steal from you," Preston sneered, turning his hateful gaze on his wife. "I charged you an admission fee. You were easy marks. You were so eager to have a real gentleman in the family, so desperate to prove you belonged in polite society, that you handed me the keys to the kingdom without asking a single question. I tolerated your obnoxious family dinners. I tolerated your complete lack of class. I married you because you were a blank check, Chloe, nothing more." The words hung in the muggy Georgia air, toxic and absolute. For a fraction of a second, the only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of a family entirely stripped of its delusions. Calvin stood perfectly still. The immaculate facade he had spent 40 years building, the country club dinners, the forced networking, the desperate clawing need to be recognized by the old money elite, crumbled into the very mud, staining his expensive loafers. He had handed his empire, his legacy, and his financial security over to a man who viewed him as nothing more than an uncultured peasant with a heavy wallet. He had alienated his brilliant, capable daughter for a smooth-talking parasite with a fabricated pedigree. The realization hit Calvin with the force of a freight train. The suffocating weight of his own profound stupidity finally broke the dam of his legendary self-control. A primal, deafening roar tore from Calvin's throat. He did not step toward Preston. He launched himself like a heat-seeking missile. The older man slammed into his son-in-law with a brutal, uncontrolled velocity that knocked the breath out of Preston's lungs in a loud, wet gasp. They crashed hard into the side of the idling taxi, the impact denting the rusted yellow door before tumbling violently into the red dirt. Calvin was blind with rage. Decades of refined corporate composure vanished, replaced by the raw, violent desperation of a man who had lost absolutely everything. He pinned Preston into the mud, his heavy fists coming down in wild, untamed strikes. Preston threw his arms up frantically, trying to shield his face, whimpering and thrashing as Calvin's knuckles connected with his jaw. Mud and blood splattered across the ruined front of Preston's linen shirt. "You parasitic fraud!" Calvin screamed, his voice cracking, spit flying from his lips. "I gave you everything. I trusted you. I let you sit at the head of my table." Preston gagged, choking on the muddy water as he tried to buck Calvin off his chest. He managed to land a desperate, scrambling elbow into Calvin's ribs, but the older man did not even flinch. Calvin grabbed Preston by the lapels, lifting his head just to slam it back down into the churning earth. I did not lift a finger. I simply stood by the open door of my Maybach, watching the architect of my childhood misery violently dismantle the architect of his financial ruin. Chloe was screaming a high-pitched, useless wail, but she made no move to help the husband who had just called her a blank check. Beatrice had covered her face with her muddy hands, rocking back and forth on her knees, completely broken by the public spectacle. Only when Calvin wrapped his thick hands around Preston's throat, his thumbs digging dangerously into the younger man's windpipe, did I decide the show was over. I gave a sharp, subtle nod to my security detail. The two massive contractors moved with terrifying synchronized speed. They did not shout or hesitate. The first guard locked his arm around Calvin's chest, lifting the heavy, thrashing patriarch effortlessly off the ground and dragging him backward. The second guard hauled a coughing, sputtering Preston to his feet, slamming him roughly against the chain-link fence to search him for weapons. "Let me go!" Calvin bellowed, his boots kicking wildly at the air as the guard hauled him several feet away. "I am going to kill him. I will rip his lying tongue out of his mouth. Stand down, Mr. Sterling." The security contractor ordered, his voice a flat, mechanical bark that broke absolutely no argument. The guard deposited Calvin back onto the ground, stepping between the older man and the fence, planting his feet in a wide, impenetrable stance. Calvin staggered. Deprived of a target, the adrenaline that had fueled his attack instantly evaporated. His knees buckled. The proud, indomitable titan of local industry collapsed into the wet dirt. His broad shoulders began to shake. The sound that came out of him was not a roar of anger, but a hollow, ragged sob. Calvin Sterling, the man who had never shed a tear in his entire adult life, was weeping openly in the street. He looked up, his chest heaving, his expensive suit torn and smeared with clay. His tear-filled eyes bypassed his hysterical wife and his catatonic youngest daughter, his gaze locked onto me. For the first time in my 32 years of life, Calvin was actually looking at me. He was not looking at the rebellious teenager who refused to wear pearls. He was not looking at the stubborn dropout who rejected his corporate mandates. He was looking at a titan. He saw the tailored suit, the armored car, the private security, and the undeniable cold power radiating from my stance. He saw the woman who had possessed the strategic foresight to secretly buy his debt and hold the very ground beneath his feet. I had outplayed the Ivy League prodigy he had worshipped. I had beaten the banks. I had won. Maya Calvin choked out, his voice a pathetic, broken rasp. He dragged himself forward on his knees, ignoring the mud soaking through his trousers. He reached a shaking hand out toward me, stopping just short of my polished shoes. "Maya, please." I was blind. I was so blind to everything. He swallowed hard tears, cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his face. "I let him poison this family." Calvin wept, gesturing weakly toward Preston, who was currently vomiting a mixture of blood and rainwater near the storm drain. "I let him convince me you were the enemy. But you were the only one who actually knew what you were doing. You saved the land. You bought the deed. You protected us when I was too stupid to see the knife at my own throat." Calvin lowered his head, his chin touching his chest in an unprecedented display of total submission. "I am sorry, Maya. I am so terribly, deeply sorry for how I treated you. Please, you have to forgive me. You have to help us fix this. You are my daughter." The air grew incredibly still. Even Chloe had stopped her hysterical sobbing, watching her father, her invincible, terrifying father, begging for mercy at the feet of the scapegoat. I looked down at the broken man in the mud. I felt no triumph. I felt no pity. The well of familial affection had dried up and turned to dust over a decade ago. I slowly stepped forward, closing the distance until the toes of my shoes nearly touched his muddy knees. I looked directly into his red, pleading eyes. "You didn't protect me when Mom threw me away," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial, uncompromising chill that cut straight through the humid night air. "Forgiveness isn't on the menu today." The silence that followed my words was absolute and suffocating. Calvin stared up at me, his heavy shoulders shaking, finally understanding that the bridge between us had been burned to ash years ago. Before he could attempt another pathetic apology, a sharp, piercing wail shattered the heavy humidity of the neighborhood. Red and blue lights began to strobe aggressively against the manicured oak trees at the far end of the street. The sound acted like a high-voltage defibrillator on my mother. Beatrice snapped her head toward the approaching sirens. In an instant, the devastating reality of her homelessness, the shocking loss of her fortune, and the betrayal of her prized son-in-law vanished. All of it was completely overwritten by a much more terrifying prospect. The neighbors were going to see them making a scene. Beatrice scrambled to her feet. She frantically brushed the wet red clay from her ruined silk skirt, though the frantic smearing only drove the dark mud deeper into the expensive fabric. She reached into her splattered designer purse, pulled out a compact mirror, and actually began attempting to fix her hair. Her hands shaking so violently she dropped her lipstick into a puddle. "Calvin, get up right now!" Beatrice hissed, her voice vibrating with a desperate, venomous panic. "Stand up! Stop this pathetic crying! The police are coming! The Abernathys are turning on their porch lights. The Sinclair family is probably watching from their upstairs window. Get off the ground this instant!" Calvin did not move. He remained on his knees in the dirt, staring blankly at the wet pavement, a completely broken man who had just realized his entire life was a lie. Beatrice spun toward Chloe, who was still staring blankly at Preston with a look of absolute soul-crushing betrayal. Beatrice grabbed her youngest daughter by the shoulders and gave her a violent, rattling shake. "Wipe your face, Chloe. Stop looking like a deranged mental patient. Stand up straight. You are a sterling. Act dignified. We are not white trash, and we will not be caught standing in the mud like common criminals when the local patrol rolls up." Beatrice was operating in a state of pure, unfiltered delusion. Her husband had just lost his entire life savings. Her golden son-in-law had just confessed to treating them like disposable cash cows. She was standing in the muddy crater of her demolished mansion. Yet her only concern was maintaining the illusion of high society superiority for the neighborhood watch. She marched directly up to me, her fake practiced country club smile suddenly plastered across her face, though her eyes were wide, manic, and completely unhinged. "Maya, you are going to handle this," Beatrice ordered, using the same condescending, authoritative tone she used to command the waitstaff at her charity galas. "When the local sheriff pulls up, you are going to step forward and tell him this is a simple real estate misunderstanding. You will tell him the demolition was a scheduled contractor error, and that we are having a minor family disagreement over property lines." I looked at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer depth of her denial. "You want me to lie to the police to save your social standing?" I asked, my voice completely flat. "You owe us that much," Beatrice snapped, pointing a dirty, manicured finger at my chest. "You caused this scene. You brought these massive security goons to my pristine street. You flaunted your little piece of paper and riled up your father. Now you are going to fix it. You will smile at the officers, you will show them your identification, and you will tell them everything is perfectly fine. We will sort out this nonsense about the deed and Preston's investments privately behind closed doors like civilized people." Preston let out a sound that was half laugh, half terrified sob. He was not looking at Beatrice. He was staring at the rapidly approaching strobe lights reflecting off the wet pavement. "They are not coming for a noise complaint," Beatrice. Preston wheezed, his chest heaving as he frantically looked for an escape route. His eyes darted toward the narrow, shadowed alleyway between the neighboring properties. But my security contractors instantly shifted their weight, completely blocking his path and forcing him back against the fence. Nonsense. Beatrice huffed, smoothing her ruined blouse one last time and ignoring him completely. It is just the local patrol. I sit on the Police Athletic League fundraising committee. I know the chief personally. I will simply explain that our contractor got a little overzealous with the demolition and that we are relocating to a luxury hotel for the evening. The sirens cut off abruptly with a loud mechanical chirp. The vehicles crested the hill and accelerated down the street, their high beams cutting blindly through the rain and darkness. Beatrice took a deep breath, pasting on her most radiant, charming smile, and stepped toward the curb to greet what she assumed was the local suburban police force, ready to cater to her wealthy demands. But the vehicles that screeched to a violent halt in front of the dirt lot were not marked police cruisers. There were 3 of them. Massive, heavily armored matte black SUVs with deeply tinted windows and reinforced steel push bars mounted on the front grilles. They did not park neatly against the curb. They angled their massive frames aggressively, completely blocking the street and boxing in the rusted taxicab Preston had arrived in. Beatrice's fake smile faltered. Her hand dropped slowly to her side. The heavy reinforced doors of the SUVs swung open simultaneously. Men and women poured out of the vehicles with terrifying synchronized military precision. They were not wearing the friendly tan uniforms of the local suburban police. They were dressed in dark tactical gear, heavy Kevlar vests, and dark windbreakers. Across the back of their windbreakers, 3 bold, bright yellow letters were printed in stark, unmistakable font. FBI. Beatrice gasped, stumbling backward into the mud, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Chloe let out a terrified shriek and scrambled behind the taxicab, trying to make herself invisible. Calvin finally looked up from the dirt, his eyes wide with shock, as he watched the tactical team swarm the perimeter of his former estate. Preston practically collapsed against the chain-link fence. His legs gave out entirely and he slid down into the mud, pulling his knees to his chest like a frightened child. He knew exactly why they were here. The offshore accounts, the wire fraud, the leveraged stolen equity. His entire house of cards had finally collapsed, and the federal government had arrived to collect the debris. A tall, broad-shouldered agent with close-cropped gray hair and a severe, uncompromising expression stepped out of the lead vehicle. He did not look at Beatrice. He did not look at the demolished house. He bypassed my security detail entirely, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene until they locked directly onto the cowering, hyperventilating man by the fence. Preston Alexander Vance, the lead agent, barked, his voice carrying absolute lethal authority over the sound of the idling engines. "Stand up and put your hands where I can see them." Preston did not move. He could not. His legs had become entirely useless, his expensive slacks sinking deeper into the wet Georgia clay. The lead agent did not repeat himself. He gestured sharply with 2 fingers, and 2 heavily armored agents bypassed my security perimeter, which parted seamlessly to let the federal authorities through. They descended upon my brother-in-law with terrifying, unfeeling efficiency. They grabbed Preston by the shoulders of his ruined linen shirt, hauled him violently to his feet, and spun him around, slamming his chest hard against the chain-link fence. The sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed like a final gavel strike across the muddy lot. Preston Alexander Vance. The lead agent continued his voice, a steady booming baritone that cut effortlessly through the humid night air. "You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." As the agent recited the Miranda rights, a second agent pulled a thick, sealed document from his tactical vest. "We are executing a federal arrest warrant issued by the United States District Court. You are being charged with 5 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of corporate embezzlement, and systemic money laundering." Preston thrashed weakly against the fence, his face pressed into the cold metal links. "It is a mistake," he blubbered, saliva and mud dripping from his chin. "I am a senior vice president. I have offshore protections. You do not understand the leverage structures. This is a corporate misunderstanding." The agents ignored his pathetic financial babble. They yanked him backward by his arms, spinning him around to face the street. Preston's eyes, wide and bloodshot with absolute terror, desperately searched the perimeter until they found his wife. Chloe Preston gasped, his voice cracking into a high-pitched guttural whine. "Chloe, listen to me. Call the firm. Call Harrison and Davis. Tell them to wire the emergency retainer. Get me a defense attorney right now. Chloe, please, you have to help me." Chloe stood perfectly still in the dirt. She looked at the man she had proudly flaunted at every charity gala, every country club dinner, and every family gathering. She looked at the man who had supposedly elevated her above me, the man who had just publicly confessed to forging her name and stealing her home. Her face, usually so carefully composed to project superiority, contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated revulsion. "Help you!" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling before rising into a harsh, bitter screech. "You forged my signature. You gambled away my house. You told my family I was nothing but a blank check." She took a deliberate, highly visible step backward, putting physical distance between herself and the federal criminal she had married. "You have nothing." Chloe spat, her eyes blazing with absolute disgust. "You are a fraud, Preston. You are entirely bankrupt. Do not ever speak to me again. I am calling a divorce attorney, not a defense lawyer." Preston's jaw dropped. It was the ultimate betrayal from the woman who had sworn to stand by him, though neither of them had ever truly understood what loyalty meant. He opened his mouth to argue, to beg, but the agents were already dragging his limp body toward the center SUV. Then the screaming started. Beatrice had finally processed that these were not local officers she could manipulate with a donation check and a sweet smile. She realized that her son-in-law was in handcuffs. Her husband was weeping in the dirt. And worst of all, the street was no longer quiet. The commotion, the flashing strobe lights, and the booming voice of the federal agent had drawn out the residents of the exclusive neighborhood. Front doors opened. Porch lights flicked on, casting long, harsh shadows across the immaculate, manicured lawns. The Abernathys stepped out onto their grand veranda. The Sinclairs wandered down to the edge of their cobblestone driveway, and in the hands of almost every single neighbor was the glowing, unmistakable rectangle of a smartphone. They were recording. No, Beatrice shrieked a sound so shrill and manic it actually startled the federal agents. "Stop it! Stop looking! Put those phones away right now!" She lunged toward the street, waving her arms frantically. Her mud-stained silk clothes and ruined hair made her look like a deranged vagrant rather than a pillar of the community. "Officers, you must stop this immediately!" she yelled, grabbing at the sleeve of the lead FBI agent. "You are ruining our reputation. Do you know who I am? I sit on the church hospitality board. I host the spring gala. You are making a spectacle in front of the Sinclairs." The agent did not even blink. He simply turned his massive frame easily, shrugging off her desperate grip, and pointed a stern, uncompromising finger directly at her face. "Ma'am, step back immediately or you will be detained for interfering with a federal investigation." Beatrice froze, her hand hovering in the air. She looked past the agent across the street where Margaret Sinclair, her fiercest rival on the country club board, was holding her phone up, capturing every single second of the Sterling family's total annihilation. The carefully curated, flawless illusion of Beatrice's aristocratic life was burning to the ground, broadcast live in high definition, to the exact people whose approval she craved more than oxygen. The ultimate humiliation was complete. Beatrice let out a low, whimpering moan, her knees buckling. She collapsed onto the wet curb, hiding her face in her hands, entirely defeated by the crushing weight of her absolute social ruin. The agents hauled Preston to the open door of the armored SUV. They pushed him against the side panel, preparing to force his head down into the back seat. But before they could shove him into the darkness, Preston planted his muddy shoes against the floorboard. He twisted his neck, fighting the agent's grip just long enough to lock eyes with me. I stood near the edge of the property. My posture relaxed, my expression a picture of absolute terrifying calm. I watched his empire burn, and I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Preston's face twisted into a snarl of pure, venomous hatred. "You set me up!" He spat the words, dripping with desperate fury. I looked at him coldly. "No, you booked the ticket. I just made sure you enjoyed the ride." The heavy steel doors of the federal vehicles slammed shut with a synchronized metallic thud that signaled the absolute end of Preston Alexander Vance. The massive black SUVs accelerated away from the curb in tight formation, their harsh red and blue strobe lights painting the manicured neighborhood in chaotic flashes of color before disappearing completely around the corner. The Abernathys and the Sinclairs lingered on their sweeping front lawns for a long moment, their smartphones finally lowering, having captured every single second of the spectacular downfall. Slowly, the neighbors retreated into their pristine, safe homes, leaving their bright porch lights burning like spotlights on a tragic theater stage. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The grinding idle of the excavators had long since ceased. All that remained of the Sterling family legacy was a flattened expanse of wet red Georgia clay, a pile of pulverized brick, and a single rusted taxicab idling uselessly by the curb. Chloe stood paralyzed in the mud. She was staring blankly at the empty street where her husband had just been carted off to federal prison in handcuffs. Her perfect manicured life was entirely gone. She had no house, no money, and no golden boy husband to shield her from reality. Her designer handbag and her phone were likely locked inside her foreclosed mansion across town. She slowly crumpled to the ground, pulling her muddy knees to her chest, rocking back and forth in a catatonic state of shock. She did not make a sound. Calvin remained exactly where my security team had deposited him. He stared at his large, empty hands, the violent fight completely drained from his massive frame. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at his youngest daughter. He simply stared into the dark abyss of his own making, a ruined titan stripped of his pride, his fortune, and his legacy. Then there was Beatrice. My mother watched the taillights of the federal vehicles vanish, and the final crushing reality of her situation shattered the very last remaining wall of her aristocratic delusion. The country club memberships were void. The luxury vehicles were repossessed. The designer clothes were packed away in a discount storage unit on the bad side of town. The mansion she had ruled from for decades was literally dirt beneath her feet. She had absolutely nothing. Beatrice slowly turned her head toward me. The manic, authoritative energy from moments before had completely evaporated, replaced by a raw, naked, primal panic. Her expensive silk skirt was ruined, her hair plastered to her face by the humid night air, her mascara running in dark, jagged lines down her pale cheeks. She took a hesitant step forward, her expensive heels sinking deep into the mud with a sickening squelch. She did not march. She did not command. She stumbled. Beatrice Sterling, the woman who had spent my entire life looking down her aristocratic nose at me, fell to her knees at my feet. The wet clay soaked instantly through the ruined silk of her skirt, staining her skin. She reached out with trembling, mud-caked hands and grabbed the hem of my tailored blazer. Maya Beatrice sobbed, the sound tearing from her throat in a desperate, ragged gasp. "Maya, please, you have to help us. We have nowhere to go." I did not pull away. I simply stood there, an immovable pillar of stone, looking down at the woman who had birthed me. The bank took the accounts. Beatrice wept, her fingers gripping the expensive fabric of my blazer with terrifying, desperate strength. Preston took the equity. "The house is gone. We cannot go to a hotel. All the credit cards are frozen. Maya, please, it is raining. We have absolutely nothing left. Look at your father. Look at your sister. You have to fix this." She looked up at me, her eyes wide, wild, and searching for any trace of the desperate, approval-starved child I used to be. She was looking for the girl who would have done anything to earn a single scrap of maternal affection. "Take us to your apartment," Beatrice pleaded, her voice rising in pitch, accelerating into a frantic babble. "You have money now. You bought this land. You must have a massive place downtown. We can stay with you. Just until we figure this out. Just until Calvin makes a few calls and clears this terrible misunderstanding up. We will take the guest room. Chloe can sleep on the sofa. You can take care of us. It will be just like old times. We can be a real family again." I looked at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer depth of her audacity. Even now, kneeling in the dirt, completely destitute and publicly humiliated, she was giving me an order wrapped in a plea. She expected me to house them, feed them, and shield them from the devastating consequences of their own toxic arrogance. Just like old times meant I would do all the heavy lifting while they reaped the benefits and criticized my efforts. When I did not immediately offer salvation, when I did not instantly bend to her will, Beatrice's panic hardened into a familiar manipulative edge. The tears continued to flow down her muddy cheeks, but her eyes sharpened desperately, searching for leverage. She resorted to the very last weapon she had left in her arsenal: weaponized guilt. "You cannot leave us out here in the street," Beatrice insisted, her voice trembling with manufactured self-righteous indignation. "I am your mother, Maya. I gave you life. I raised you. I put a roof over your head for 18 years. You owe me this. The Bible says a good Christian daughter honors her mother and father. You cannot turn your back on your own flesh and blood when they are in desperate need. It is a sin. You will be judged for this." This was the absolute pinnacle of her hypocrisy. For a decade, they had treated me like a contagious disease. They had banished me to the shadows so they could worship a corporate fraud. They had openly declared that my very existence was an embarrassment to their pristine social standing. They had actively hidden my existence from their high society friends. I slowly reached down. I grabbed my mother's muddy, desperate hands and firmly peeled her fingers off the fabric of my blazer. I did not squeeze, but my grip was unbreakable. I let her hands drop back into the wet dirt. I leaned forward, bringing my face level with hers. I looked directly into her terrified, unhinged eyes. "A good mother doesn't tell her daughter she isn't family." The words struck Beatrice like a physical blow. She recoiled, her hands slipping from the fabric of my blazer, and slumped back onto her heels in the wet Georgia clay. The manic desperation in her eyes briefly flickered into pure, unfiltered hatred before the crushing weight of her reality stamped it out entirely. She was kneeling in the mud, surrounded by the ruins of her demolished mansion, while the neighbors she had spent decades trying to impress watched her total humiliation from their pristine front lawns. "You cannot mean this," Beatrice whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain hitting the pavement. "We are your family, Maya. We are your blood. You have a massive penthouse downtown. You have more money than you could ever spend in a lifetime. You cannot just leave us sitting on the curb like stray dogs." I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a stray dog. I looked at the mud caked into her expensive silk skirt and the ruined, desperate expression on her face. "You are not moving into my penthouse, Beatrice," I stated, my voice as cold and smooth as polished glass. "You are not going to drink my wine, sleep in my guest rooms, or pretend that we have suddenly magically healed decades of emotional abuse just because your bank accounts have been frozen. You made it perfectly clear that I was not welcome in your world when you thought you had millions. You do not get to invite yourself into my world now that you have nothing." Calvin let out a long, ragged exhale from his spot in the dirt. He did not look up. He just continued staring at his empty hands, fully comprehending the absolute finality of my words. Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless sob. She looked around frantically, as if expecting a hidden camera crew to jump out and announce this was all a cruel prank. But there was only the cold rain, the flattened lot, and the rusted taxicab idling by the curb. "Then where do we go?" she pleaded, the last remnants of her pride dissolving into the mud. "We have no cash. The credit cards are locked. The bank took the cars. We literally do not have a roof over our heads." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a plain, heavy brass key attached to a cheap plastic tag. I let it dangle from my index finger, the metal catching the faint glow of the streetlights. "I am not a monster, Beatrice," I said smoothly. "I anticipated that your golden boy would eventually drag you all down with him. I prepaid a 1-year lease on an apartment in the Southside District." Beatrice's eyes locked onto the key, a sudden desperate relief washing over her face. She reached out, her muddy fingers trembling. "Southside," she repeated, trying to process the location. "But that is the industrial zone. That is where the factory workers live. It is right next to the interstate. It is a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom walk-up on the 3rd floor," I clarified, keeping the key just out of her reach. It has linoleum floors, a noisy radiator, and the kitchen appliances are from the late 90s. But the roof does not leak the door locks, and the rent is paid in full for the next 12 months. It is exactly what you need to survive. Beatrice swallowed hard, her ingrained snobbery battling with her desperate need for shelter. She reached for the key again. "Thank you." She murmured the words clearly, tasting like ash in her mouth. "I suppose we can make do until Calvin liquidates some of his minor assets." I snatched the key back, tucking it safely into my palm. "I did not say it was a gift," I corrected her, my tone dropping dangerously low. "There is a condition." Beatrice froze. Her eyes darted to my face, recognizing the lethal, uncompromising business tone I had developed over the last 5 years. A tone she had always dismissed as unladylike. "What condition?" she asked warily. "Tomorrow is Sunday," I began, pacing slowly in front of her. "Every Sunday for the past 20 years, you have marched into the First Presbyterian Church of Oakhead, sat in the front pew, and flaunted your wealth, your status, and your perfectly curated family image. You have used that congregation as a stage to judge everyone else in this town." Beatrice flinched instinctively, knowing where this was going. "Tomorrow morning," I continued, "you are going to walk into that church. You are going to stand up at the pulpit during the community announcements. And you are going to confess everything." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Confess what?" "You will look your high society friends directly in the eyes," I commanded, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "You will tell them that your son-in-law, Preston Vance, is a federal criminal who stole your entire fortune. You will tell them that Calvin is entirely bankrupt because he blindly trusted a fraud. And most importantly, you will tell them that the only reason you are not sleeping in a homeless shelter tonight is because Maya, the daughter you publicly disowned and treated like garbage, paid your rent." "No," Beatrice breathed, horror washing over her face. She scrambled backward in the mud, shaking her head frantically. "I cannot do that. Maya, please. You cannot ask me to do that. It would be social suicide. Margaret Sinclair will be there. The Abernathys will be there. They will laugh at me. They will banish me from the charity committees. I will be a laughingstock." I looked down at her, completely unmoved by her panic. "Those are the terms, Beatrice. You want the key to a warm apartment, you pay for it with the truth. You strip away the lies, the fake superiority, and the gaslighting, and you finally admit to the entire town exactly who and what you are. If you do not want to do it, that is perfectly fine. The lease can be canceled with a single phone call. You can figure out how to survive on the streets tonight." Beatrice looked at me, searching for any sign of bluffing. She found none. She slowly turned her head toward her husband. "Calvin," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Calvin, tell her this is insane. Tell her we cannot do this." Calvin finally raised his head. His eyes were hollow, defeated, and utterly broken. He looked at the empty dirt lot where his mansion used to stand, then at the brass key in my hand. "Do it, Beatrice." Calvin rasped, his voice sounding like dry gravel. "The house is gone. The money is gone. The pride is gone. Just take the damn key so we can get out of the rain." Beatrice let out a long, shuddering sob. The last pillar of her delusion collapsed. She bowed her head, her shoulders shaking, and held out her open, muddy palm. I dropped the cheap brass key into her hand. During this entire exchange, Chloe had remained completely silent. She had been standing near the rusted taxi, staring blankly at the spot where the federal agents had hauled Preston away. But as Beatrice closed her fist around the apartment key, Chloe suddenly snapped out of her catatonic state. "Wait!" Chloe said, her voice sharp and panicked. She marched over her ruined designer heels, sinking into the mud. "You said it is a 2-bedroom apartment." "That is correct," I replied. "Well, Mom and Dad get 1 bedroom." Chloe calculated, her eyes narrowing, as the grim reality of her new poverty set in. "Who gets the 2nd bedroom? I have to have my own space. I need room for my clothes and my vanity. And what about my allowance? I cannot survive in the industrial district without a stipend. Where am I supposed to live?" I stared at my younger sister. Even now, stripped of everything, her absolute entitlement remained untouched. She genuinely believed she was above the consequences of the disaster she had helped create. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer one last time. I pulled out a single neatly folded piece of white paper. I held it out to her. Chloe frowned hesitantly, taking the paper from my hand. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the bold black text printed at the top. It was not a check. It was not a deed to a property. It was a standard employment application for the fast food burger franchise located exactly 2 blocks away from her new apartment in the South Side district. "What is this?" Chloe asked, staring at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. I looked her dead in the eyes, allowing a slow, razor-sharp smile to spread across my face. "Time to clock in, sis." The morning sun poured through the massive stained glass windows of the First Presbyterian Church of Oakhead, casting fractured rainbows across the polished mahogany pews. It was exactly 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. The sanctuary was packed to absolute capacity. Rumors of the federal raid on the Sterling property had spread through the exclusive Georgia suburb with the speed and ferocity of a wildfire. Every country club member, every charity board director, and every gossiping neighbor had shown up today, dressed in their Sunday best, hungry for the scandal of the decade. I sat in the very front row center aisle. I wore a tailored stark white suit that radiated pristine, untouchable authority. My posture was flawless. I did not fidget. I did not look back at the whispering crowds. I simply kept my eyes locked on the altar, waiting for the final act of this tragedy to commence. 2 rows behind me, Calvin and Chloe sat huddled together. They looked like shadows of their former selves. Calvin stared blankly at his dress shoes, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. Chloe looked physically ill, her eyes red and puffy, likely from crying all night in the cheap linoleum-floored apartment I had provided. She was no longer a wealthy socialite. She was a fast food applicant facing her first shift. As the choir finished their opening hymn, the senior pastor stepped up to the pulpit. He cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "We have a special testimony this morning," the pastor announced, his voice echoing through the vaulted sanctuary. "Beatrice Sterling has asked to address the congregation." A collective, breathless hush fell over the 3,000 people in the room. You could hear a pin drop. Margaret Sinclair, sitting across the aisle from me, actually leaned forward, her eyes wide with predatory anticipation. Beatrice emerged from the side door near the choir loft. Her walk to the center stage was a death march. She had managed to find a modest black dress from her remaining belongings, but she could not hide the profound devastation etched into every line of her face. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch who had ruled this church's social circles for 20 years was gone. In her place was a broken, humiliated woman who had lost absolutely everything. She stepped up to the acrylic podium. Her hands were shaking so violently, she had to grip the edges of the stand to steady herself. The microphone picked up her ragged, trembling breath, broadcasting her panic through the massive speakers. She looked out at the sea of faces, the people whose approval she had valued above her own family, and then she looked down at me. I offered her nothing. No comforting nod, no sympathetic smile, just the cold, expectant silence of a woman waiting to be paid what she was owed. Beatrice swallowed hard, adjusting the microphone. "I stand before you today, not as a leader of this church," Beatrice began, her voice cracking instantly, "but as a sinner. A prideful, foolish woman who built her entire life on a foundation of lies." A soft murmur rippled through the back pews. Beatrice gripped the podium tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Many of you saw the federal vehicles at my property last night," she continued, tears brimming in her eyes. "I can no longer hide the truth. My family is completely bankrupt. We have lost everything. The man we trusted, my son-in-law, Preston Vance, is a federal criminal. He committed systemic wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. He stole our fortune, he forged documents, and he has been arrested by the FBI. The gasp from the congregation was audible. Margaret Sinclair covered her mouth with a manicured hand, her eyes darting gleefully to the other board members. The illusion was shattered. The Sterlings were officially the biggest disgrace in Oakhead history. But Beatrice was not done. The lease on her new apartment depended on the second half of her confession. She took a shuddering breath, crying real agonizing tears of a shattered ego. I was blinded by my own vanity. Beatrice wept, the microphone amplifying her raw, humiliating sobs. I idolized wealth. I worshipped social status. I elevated a white-collar criminal because he looked the part of high society, and in doing so, I committed an unforgivable sin against my own flesh and blood. She turned her head, forcing herself to look directly at me. The congregation followed her gaze, thousands of eyes suddenly resting on the woman in the pristine white suit. I treated my own daughter, Maya, like dirt. Beatrice confessed, her voice thick with shame. I was embarrassed by her independence. I punished her for refusing to conform to my superficial standards. I ignored the fact that she is a brilliant, successful, independent Black woman who built her own empire from nothing. I treated her as an outsider because she did not fit the shallow, bigoted mold I created for this family. Tears freely streamed down Beatrice's face, now ruining her makeup, exposing the raw, ugly truth she had hidden for decades. I turned my back on my own child, Beatrice sobbed. And yet last night, when the bank took our home, and we were left standing in the mud with nowhere to go, Preston's wealthy friends did not answer the phone. The country club did not offer us shelter. The only reason Calvin, Chloe, and I are not sleeping on the streets today is because Maya paid for a roof over our heads. She saved us, and I have never done a single thing to deserve her grace. I am profoundly, deeply sorry. The silence in the megachurch was absolute. The wealthy, judgmental congregation sat paralyzed, entirely captivated by the total destruction of Beatrice Sterling's pride. She had bared her darkest sins to the very people she had spent her life trying to impress. I looked at the broken woman sobbing at the pulpit. The debt was paid in full. I felt no joy, no lingering anger, just a profound, cleansing emptiness. The phantom chains of seeking my mother's approval dissolved completely, leaving me untethered and free. An usher, clearly unsure of how to proceed, in the heavy silence, nervously stepped forward into the center aisle holding the velvet collection plate. I stood up. The rustle of my suit was the only sound in the cavernous room. Every eye remained fixed on me. I reached into my designer handbag, pulled out a crisp, newly printed $100 bill, and casually dropped it into the brass plate. I turned my back on my weeping mother, my broken father, and my humiliated sister. I walked down the long, carpeted center aisle, the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels echoing through the silent church like the ticking of a clock. I pushed open the heavy wooden double doors, stepping out into the blinding, beautiful Sunday sunlight, and I walked away without ever looking back. The paper crumpled slightly in Chloe's trembling hand as she stared down at the fast food application, her mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping. I did not wait for her to find her voice, nor did I wait for my parents to offer another pathetic excuse. I simply turned on my heel, my security detail falling into a tight, synchronized formation around me, and walked away from the muddy ruins of the Sterling estate. Sunday morning arrived with the harsh, blinding clarity that only follows a violent storm. The sky over Oakhead was a brilliant, cloudless blue, mocking the absolute devastation that had gutted my family the night before. The First Presbyterian Church of Oakhead was not just a place of worship. It was the ultimate social battleground for the suburban elite. It was a sprawling, opulent megachurch with soaring stained glass windows, rich mahogany pews, and a congregation that cared far more about designer labels and stock portfolios than scripture. For 20 years, Beatrice Sterling had treated this sanctuary like her personal kingdom. She had directed the choir, organized the spring galas, and used her front row pew as a throne from which she judged the rest of the town. I arrived exactly 10 minutes before the service began. I wore a tailored, stark white suit that radiated pristine, untouchable authority. As I walked down the center aisle, the low, buzzing hum of conversation immediately died. The silence that swept through the cavernous room was palpable. Whispers had already torn through the neighborhood about the FBI raid. They knew Preston was gone. They knew Calvin's accounts were frozen. What they did not know was why I, the estranged, discarded daughter, was walking with the posture of a conquering queen. I slid into the very first pew center aisle. I sat directly in the line of sight of the pulpit, crossing my legs and resting my hands neatly in my lap. The senior pastor stepped up to the acrylic podium. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, sweating slightly under the hot stage lights. He cleared his throat, his eyes darting nervously across the congregation before resting on me. Before we begin our morning announcements, the pastor echoed, his voice vibrating with palpable tension. Sister Beatrice has requested a moment to address the congregation. A collective breathless gasp rippled through the 3,000 people in the room. From the side door near the choir loft, Beatrice emerged. The sight of her sent a shockwave of whispers through the pews. She was wearing a plain, unadorned black dress. Her hair, usually sprayed into a rigid, perfect helmet, hung limp and flat against her shoulders. She looked aged, broken, and entirely stripped of her arrogant armor. She shuffled toward the center stage, leaning heavily on the wooden railing of the stairs, as if she could barely support her own weight. She gripped the sides of the podium. The microphone picked up her ragged, shallow breathing. She looked out at the sea of wealthy, judgmental faces, the very people she had spent decades trying to impress. Margaret Sinclair, the head of the charity committee, was sitting 2 rows behind me, leaning forward with predatory anticipation. Beatrice lowered her head, closing her eyes as the first tear slipped down her cheek. "I stand before you today," Beatrice began, her voice cracking instantly, not as a leader of this community, but as a deeply flawed, sinful woman who has lost everything. The silence in the megachurch became deafening. Last night, she continued, her voice trembling. The federal authorities raided our property. My son-in-law, Preston Vance, the man I proudly paraded in front of this congregation, is a criminal. He stole our fortune. He embezzled millions. He forged my youngest daughter's name. And because my husband and I blindly trusted him, we are entirely bankrupt. The congregation shifted uncomfortably, the scandal too massive to easily digest. But Beatrice knew the terms of our deal. Her survival depended on the second half of her confession. She looked up, her bloodshot eyes locking directly onto mine. But my greatest sin was not financial. Beatrice wept, real agonizing tears of a shattered ego spilling down her face. My greatest sin was the idolization of wealth and the horrific treatment of my own flesh and blood. I worshipped money. I worshipped a white, wealthy son-in-law because he fit the superficial, bigoted image of what I thought high society demanded. And because of my own profound ignorance and shallow pride, I treated my own successful black daughter like dirt. The admission hung in the air, heavy and absolute. I was embarrassed by her independence. Beatrice sobbed, the microphone amplifying her raw, humiliating confession. I punished her for refusing to conform to my toxic standards. I hid her away and pretended she did not exist because I was intimidated by her brilliance. I threw away my own child to chase an illusion of perfection. She gripped the microphone, her knuckles turning white, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Last night, when we were left standing in the mud with absolutely nothing, the people in this room did not answer our calls. The country club did not offer us shelter. The only reason we are not sleeping on the streets today is because Maya, the daughter I publicly disowned and abused, paid to keep a roof over our heads. She is the one holding this family up, and I have never done a single thing to deserve her grace. I am a fool, and I am profoundly, deeply sorry. The community looked on in absolute shock. Margaret Sinclair's jaw had practically unhinged. Beatrice had just committed the ultimate social suicide, stripping away every lie and laying her darkest sins bare. There was no coming back from this. The illusion was dead. An usher, sweating and visibly panicked by the heavy, suffocating silence, stepped into the center aisle, holding the velvet collection plate. He hesitated, unsure if he should proceed with the service. I stood up. The rustle of my suit was the only sound in the sanctuary. Every eye in the building remained fixed on me. I reached into my designer handbag, pulled out a crisp, newly printed $100 bill, and let it flutter down into the brass plate. I turned my back on my weeping mother. I walked down the long carpeted center aisle, the sharp rhythmic click of my heels echoing like a final gavel strike. I pushed open the heavy double doors, stepping out into the blinding, beautiful Sunday sunlight, and walked away without looking back.